Deep inside a secure, windowless conference room in California, the leaders of the world's most powerful semiconductor giants sat in complete silence. They weren't looking at quarterly earnings or marketing projections. They were looking at a single teardown report of a smartphone, manufactured thousands of miles away. Inside that phone was a microchip that, according to every expert model in Washington, was simply impossible for that country to build. For years, Western executives had reassured themselves with a single comfort. They believed that while other nations could assemble devices, manufacture plastics, and run massive factories, they could never master the absolute peak of human engineering, the microchip. It was the ultimate moat, a high-tech fortress protected by thousands of patents, trillions of dollars in research, and equipment so complex that a single machine takes hundreds of shipping containers just to move. And yet, lying on that conference table was undeniable physical proof that the fortress wall had just been scaled. But here is what almost nobody realized at the time. This single chip wasn't just a technological achievement. It was a direct threat to the financial survival of Silicon Valley's biggest names. And that's exactly where everything changed. To understand why the world's wealthiest corporations are quietly panicking, you first have to understand a fundamental secret about the tech industry that executives rarely admit on television. America's biggest chip companies, the giants that design the processors powering everything from supercomputers to modern electric cars, don't actually survive on domestic sales. They rely on a massive, seemingly endless wave of revenue from foreign markets, and specifically, from the very nation they were told to restrict. For decades, a staggering percentage of their total global profits came from selling hardware directly to overseas assembly lines. That cash flow wasn't just profit, it was the lifeblood that funded the next generation of research and development. Without it, the speed of innovation slows down, expensive projects get canceled, and talent leaves. So when strict trade restrictions and export bans were suddenly signed into law, intended to freeze a rising global rival out of the high-tech race permanently, something unexpected happened. The intent was to choke off access to advanced computing power, but the actual economic reality was far more complicated, because when you cut off a massive customer, you don't just stop them from buying. You force them to stop depending on you, and nobody knew why this mattered so much until just a few short years later. In the immediate aftermath of the bans, executive suites across Silicon Valley didn't celebrate a strategic victory. Instead, emergency meetings were called. The numbers were brutal. Billions of dollars in booked orders evaporated overnight. Stock prices wobbled, but the real nightmare wasn't the lost revenue of that single quarter. It was the long-term unintended consequence that was quietly set in motion. Deprived of Western components, foreign tech giants didn't surrender, and they didn't slow down. Instead, backed by hundreds of billions in direct state capital, an entire foreign nation embarked on the most aggressive, hyper-funded technological mobilization in human history. Projects that were originally scheduled to take 15 years were suddenly squeezed into 3-year deadlines. Engineers were ordered to work around the clock building alternative architectures, domestic fabrication lines, and new software bridges. They weren't trying to match Western quality overnight. They were trying to achieve absolute structural independence. And while Western executives were publicly reassuring investors that these domestic efforts would fail due to technological complexity, behind closed doors, the mood was rapidly shifting. But here's the twist that changed the battle completely. The real danger to American chip giants wasn't that a foreign rival would build a better chip today. It was the horrifying realization of what happens when that rival builds a good enough chip tomorrow. In the tech ecosystem, high-end flagships get all the headlines, but legacy hardware, the millions of standard processors used in everyday cars, home appliances, industrial machinery, and medical devices, generate the massive volume that keeps the entire industry afloat. While Western firms remained hyper-focused on pushing the absolute physical limits of nanometer miniaturization for high-end servers, Foreign factories began quietly monopolizing the lower and middle layers of the entire global supply chain. They flooded their own domestic markets with locally produced alternative chips, systematically replacing Western suppliers contract by contract, line by line, suddenly. American corporations weren't just losing access to advanced market sales, they were losing their foundational customer base for standard hardware. The very market that provided the capital to fund high-end R&D was quietly closing its doors. And remember those emergency boardroom meetings? This is why they mattered so much. Chief financial officers quickly calculated the bleak mathematical reality. If Silicon Valley loses access to 30 to 40% of its addressable market, it can no longer afford the multi-billion-dollar price tag required to build the next generation of microchips. It creates a fatal economic loop. Less revenue leads to reduced research budgets. Reduced budgets lead to slower innovation, and slower innovation allows aggressive competitors to close the performance gap even faster. Recognizing this existential trap, several prominent tech CEOs took an unprecedented step. They didn't travel to tech expos or investor summits. They quietly boarded flights to Washington, D.C. behind closed doors in congressional offices. They delivered a startling warning to lawmakers. The very policy designed to maintain technological dominance was rapidly accelerating the exact scenario it was meant to prevent. They argued that total decoupling wouldn't cripple foreign innovation. It would simply force the creation of an entirely independent, fully self-sustaining foreign supply chain completely immune to Western influence. The lawmakers listened, but the policy direction was already set in stone. And that's precisely when the situation escalated from an economic dispute into a global supply crisis. While politicians debated in capital cities, foreign research labs were achieving breakthroughs that Western models predicted were impossible without specialized Western machinery. Using older technology, clever multi-patterning techniques, and radically redesigned software frameworks, foreign engineers successfully produced advanced multi-nanometer processors entirely on domestic soil. When those processors were quietly integrated into consumer hardware and stress-tested, analysts in the West were stunned. The yields were lower and the manufacturing cost was significantly higher, but the chips worked. The theoretical barrier was officially broken. The moat that took half a century to build had been crossed in less than 5 years. Suddenly, the narrative of absolute technological containment collapsed. American chip leaders realized they were no longer competing against a customer trying to buy their products. They were competing against an emerging, fully integrated parallel technological ecosystem. An ecosystem that didn't use Western design software, didn't rely on Western foundries, and didn't care about Western patents. But the real crisis was still to come. Today, the world finds itself at a critical, unprecedented tipping point in computing history. The global tech landscape is splitting into two distinct digital hemispheres. On one side stands the established Western model, reliant on hyper-specialized global supply chains spanning dozens of countries. On the other side, a rapidly maturing, entirely sovereign foreign network built out of sheer necessity. Designed to operate completely independently of the West, American chip companies now face a terrifying commercial reality. If they are barred from selling to the world's largest consumer market, their long-term growth stalls. But if they are allowed to sell restricted hardware, they risk transferring critical technological capabilities. It is a complete trap with no simple way out, and as foreign manufacturers continue to scale up domestic production, improving their manufacturing yields month by month, the price of hardware could soon plummet globally. If low-cost, locally produced foreign chips begin flooding international markets across Latin America, Europe, and Asia, Western chip giants could find themselves priced out of the very world they helped create. What started as a targeted trade restriction to safeguard advanced computing power has accidentally ignited a global industrial revolution that no single government or corporation can now control. Silicon Valley isn't terrified because its technology is failing. It is terrified because it is losing its monopoly on the future. The race for computational dominance is no longer about who can design the smallest transistor. It is about who can survive the fracture of the global supply chain. And as new fabrication plants come